everyone, welcome to Punctuated Equilibrium Theory, responding to policy problems. My name is Mavis and I'll be taking you through theory fundamentals. So the first thing you should know about Punctuated Equilibrium Theory is that it comes from Baumgartner and Jones. The theory comes from the author's personal experience in evolutionary science, and you can really observe a model that applies a biological theory to policy making. The theory is founded on a biological theory of evolutionary punctuated equilibrium from Gould and Eldridge. So if you look on screen right now, incremental evolution is typically seen as a linear experience, whereas punctuated equilibrium posits that certain punctuations or events cause divergences in evolution. And from Schacht-Snyder, we get the concept of conflict expansion, which is really one of the cornerstones of this model. Smith emphasizes the importance of policy image in PET and defines this as a combination of values and empirical knowledge. PET is concerned with the public image as well, which is the way that public policy is discussed in public and in media. Now, Kearney suggests that public policies are compatible with multiple or several images, and Priley introduces the concept of venue shopping in PET and how this can help generate policy punctuation. So what are PET's key concepts? Well, I'll take you through what we think they are. The first is, it is a single process that explains extreme stability, which manifests as a status quo bias and short bursts of rapid change. So this theory offers an explanation for why stability in public policies and radical changes occurs. And according to this theory, they derive from the same process. The second key concept is non-incremental change, and this explains how change isn't necessarily incremental. Long periods of equilibrium were already well defined by incrementalist theories, but Baumgartner and Jones really brought in an additional change element. The next key concept is unexpected events. So the theory explores how unexpected events trigger moments of policy agenda setting, and PET really describes a biological preference for stagnation and equilibriums as a survival mechanism. The theory also describes the impact of often unexpected dramatic changes, mostly coming from external sources, and this is similar to examples of spontaneous genetic or species divergence and emergence. So the next key concept is non-rational choices. So the theory can be taken as opposing key concepts of rational choice theories by introducing and acknowledging natural complexity and irrationality. And the theory acknowledges the chaotic nature of humans. The next key concept is feedback loops. So the theory defines that negative feedback loops tend to support the status quo, and positive feedback loops tend to be the impetuses for change as potential explosive change moments. The sixth key concept is macropolitics. So macropolitics is where punctuation typically occurs. The response can be very reactive and may overcorrect the problems. The next key concept is the US political context. So this theory is drawn from the US political context, and it has an inherent bias towards Western democratic systems. Now we note the dominance of pluralism in the US, which describes power as being distributed in specific subsystems as a result of resource limits for decision makers. Baumgartner and Jones calls subsystems sub-governments that operate with autonomy and influence in their respective spheres or venues of influence. The next key concept is policy venue. So there are a vast variety of venues to which a conflict may be directed, which might not involve mass mobilization or the public sphere at all. And this is where the idea of serial and parallel processing come into play, which is how attention is created or generated. We'll take you through that in detail in a second. We see from this theory opportunities of movement between policy venues, and this depends on the goals of the actors. So these can be constrained or self-centered. The theory also introduces the concept of venue shopping. So no rule determines which policy venue in society has complete jurisdiction over a particular issue, and the policy venue associated with the debate can change or even multiply over time. So if a particular venue is not working out for you, you may want to consider another policy venue. The next key concept is subsystem collapse. So this is quite simply, the more participants there are, the higher the risk of subsystem collapse. And conflict expansion is a cornerstone of PET. So the last key concept is policy image as agenda setting. So a policy image is how a problem is defined or created. And the theory is all about the framing of public images. The theory defines how public images are created based on interpretation of a prism of beliefs and values. The policy reflects the norms and values of society and decision makers. There is a shifting relationship between policy venues and policy images. Both components have a strong impact on the other, and by extension, the dominant voices may also change. We also see the interaction of images and venues producing self-reinforcing systems sometimes that is characterized by positive feedback mechanisms, and that means that there may also be a snowball effect as images and venue changes continue to reinforce each other over time. The theory denies the complete control of institutions, which might be a weakness of the theory. The mechanism available to the discontented are basically change the policy image, expand conflict to include actors who were previously uninvolved, or shop for new policy venues.
Let's look now at the strengths of the PET approach, as well as some of the theoretical weaknesses and critiques. The core strength of PET is that it offers an explanation of stability and rapid change in policymaking. It demonstrates that issue framing and shifting policy images can both expand or contain policy change. PET explains how all actors can try to influence policy change, either by controlling it or by changing it. The broad policy response to COVID is a good example of how an issue is framed and can change over time. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the issue of how to respond was clearly framed as a health issue, with a collective effort required to flatten the curve, reduce harm, and protect healthcare workers and resources. Technical health experts were the predominant public voices, and decision makers were health experts. Policy decisions followed this lead. Over time, with changes in public opinion, media coverage, and different actors influencing the COVID policy response, the framing shifted to the economy. The economic framing resulted in new actors entering the policy-making space, and in some cases, changes in decision makers and policy outcomes. For example, how and when lockdowns were used and when they were not. PET also uses the concepts of positive and negative feedback loops to understand maintenance of status quo and sudden change. This is derived from mathematics, where positive feedback produces system change and negative feedback maintains system stability. PET is also good at explaining the interaction between institutions and external factors. It is useful to explain policy complexity and the interplay between internal and external actor interactions. It also illustrates that governments can be hindered by information processing challenges. PET illuminates understandings of how governments process information. In this theory, attention matters. Policy making is often understood as a rational process whereby actors in governments gather all the information and make linear policy decisions in response to this information. PET demonstrates that government attention is scarce and governments often need to deal with multiple issues and information in parallel. It acknowledges and explains the role of subsystems. So PET is useful in foregrounding the role of subsystems in assisting governments to deal with these issues in parallel. It also illuminates the interaction between policy images and policy monopolies, and explains how policy monopolies can contain change and maintain the status quo by controlling the policy image. It can also explain how decision-making can be influenced at different levels and venues. It describes how actors try to act upon policy venues either by limiting them or by gaining support for their own position in a new policy venue. As a result, policy venues are framed as contestable and changeable spaces. This theory is especially good at explaining policy changes in countries with a federal system like US, Australia, Canada, as these systems provide opportunities for venue shopping at multiple levels. There are, however, some theoretical weaknesses in PET. It's less applicable to non-pluralistic and non-Western political systems, although as Chan and Zhao demonstrate, policy punctuations can occur in authoritarian political systems such as China, although this is driven more by policymakers' degree of exposure to information rather than institutional friction more commonly seen in liberal democracies. PET is also inherently descriptive in nature. It does not tend to explain the underlying causal mechanisms of change. It also subscribes to a narrow definition of change. The concept of policy change occurring during punctuation ignores that change can be a continuous process, and this approach means that it can ignore the importance of slow, steady progress on policy changes. The 2010 Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, in the United States provides a good example of this. While often cited as a punctuation, this overlooks decades of incremental healthcare changes such as Medicare in 1965, Medicaid expansion, employer insurance regulations, and state-level reforms that gradually built the foundation for comprehensive reform. PET's focus on the dramatic 2010 moment misses how incremental changes over 40 years made the Obamacare policy change possible. It is also often difficult to define what constitutes a punctuation. There is also a lack of precision regarding the rules that govern subsystems. This is especially evident in the reactions that can be expected from threatened subsystems. For example, if actors manage to expand conflict and cause a punctuation, their policy goal may not necessarily be adopted. It also assumes attention is a scarce resource, and the main goal is to capture government attention. Critiques of PET include lacking agency within the theory, and so while acknowledging the role of policy entrepreneurs, Shockley in 2017 suggests that PET is too mechanistic and fails to account for the complex interplay of human agency, decision-making, and the symbolic and emotional aspects of policy change. PET also centres institutions and subsystems as the main venue of policy making, so it can't fully describe the policy change process. Not suitable for analysing an issue that has high continuous salience. As mentioned, PET assumes that policy makers have limited capacity to focus on many issues at the same time, and this creates a subsystem equilibrium where the status quo tends to be maintained. Therefore, PET is not as applicable for analysing an issue that has high continuous salience as when a specific issue does not receive enough attention until something dramatic happens, causing moral panic and triggering changes and sometimes overreactions, the status quo is more likely to be maintained. This is described in the UK by Jennings et al. When law and order policy changes were made following the shocking murder of James Bulger. PET also does not explain the role of political parties in subsystems and doesn't describe active government decision-making. What happens if governments just decide to make a policy change? PET does not explain this. And it doesn't explain institutional constraints on subsystems or institutional reactions when these subsystems are threatened. So, as Massey Jolicoeur in Canada summarised PET as a seductive but incomplete theoretical model, despite some limitations, PET offers an important and enduring theoretical understanding of policy change and is a valuable addition to a broad policy analysis toolkit.